They laughed at her coat, sneered at her hair, questioned her presence like she'd wandered in from the wrong side of the city. One clerk smirked and said she must be lost. Another whispered she looked like she was here to clean, not to be served. A third pulled out a form meant for the illiterate and slid it across the counter without blinking. Not a single one of them stopped to ask who she was, because in their eyes, her skin had already answered that. They mocked her with policy, insulted her through protocol, and turned a marble-floor institution into a stage for humiliation. But the silence she held wasn't submission. It was calculation, because what they saw as weakness was something else entirely. They mistook composure for compliance. They mistook dignity for permission. And now every name they laughed at, every glance they weaponized, is coming back to collect its cost. This story isn't about revenge. It's about exposure. You think you've seen a twist? You haven't. Stay locked in. Hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And which moment made your jaw drop? The fall doesn't come with a warning. It comes with a name they should have known. The morning air still clung to the polished glass of the Stonefield and Grant Financial Center, the building's facade gleaming like a monument to wealth. Inside, the lobby glowed with soft golden light bouncing off limestone floors and brass fixtures. Everyone moved like they belonged, heels tapping with certainty, voices humming with entitlement, credit cards flashing like credentials. Then the doors slid open, and Leora Gaines stepped inside. She carried nothing but a small leather folio and wore a simple, earth-tone wool coat over tailored slacks and sensible shoes. Her stride was unhurried, her posture exact, eyes scanning with cool precision as she approached the inner barrier where the real gatekeeping began. Before she could take another step, a security guard shifted into her path. He was broad-shouldered, mid-50s, with thinning hair combed straight back and a radio clipped neatly to his belt. His gaze started at her shoes and crawled upward, pausing deliberately at her scarf, her skin, her tightly braided hair. His hand didn't touch her, but hovered just enough to let her know she was being stopped. Without a greeting, he asked where she was going. His tone wasn't curious, it was suspicious. Behind her, the doors hissed open again, and a man strolled in wearing a stained college hoodie and AirPods, nodding to a beat only he could hear. The guard didn't so much as glance at him. Leora, unmoved, opened her folio and presented a crisp cream card bearing a small embossed seal. The guard squinted at it longer than necessary. A lesser woman might have said something. Leora didn't. She waited. He frowned, handed it back, then pointed to the right. Not toward the concierge counter where wealth advisors greeted their appointments, but toward the row of basic tellers meant for walk-ins and cash deposits. Leora ignored his gesture and turned toward the concierge anyway. She knew where she was going. She had been here before. But the quiet that followed her footsteps wasn't the hush of respect. It was the stillness of scrutiny. Behind the marble counter stood a young receptionist with sleek black hair and a headset cupping one ear. Her nameplate read Mallory. She offered a smile that vanished before it reached her eyes. Leora gave her name, her appointment time, and produced the original invitation from Director Vasquez's office. Mallory glanced at the paper, hesitated, then typed something into her system. Her fingers paused midway, then backtracked, tapped again, brows furrowing. She looked up, said she would need to verify a few things. Would Leora mind waiting a moment? Her voice was polite, but off-tempo, like someone forcing manners through clenched teeth. Leora nodded once. A moment turned into 6, then 12. As she stood, another client approached. A man with graying temples and a pastel polo shirt was ushered in instantly with a handshake and a smile. A woman in oversized sunglasses and loud jewelry was next. No delay, no waiting. Leora was still standing. Eventually, Mallory returned, eyes fixed just left of Leora's face. She gestured toward a row of chairs across from a coffee machine, seats clearly placed for overflow and clients without appointments. Leora followed the motion and sat, her movements unhurried, her face unreadable. The chair was cold. The AC vent overhead blasted stale air onto her neck. From her angle, She could see into the glass offices where other clients were being served, where coffee was poured into porcelain, where leather folders were passed across desks with careful deference. A man with a sharp widow's peak and a Rolex adjusted his cuff while a junior associate bowed slightly to whisper in his ear. Across the waiting area, a woman whispered to her friend, her eyes flicking briefly toward Leora and back, lips barely moving. Leora noticed. She noticed everything. Time crawled. No one spoke to her again. The receptionist stopped making eye contact. But her body, refined by years of boardroom battles and buried indignities, felt the chill not in temperature, but in the repetition of this ritual. She had learned long ago that some institutions weren't built to see you, at least not with respect. Her name had still not been called. But finally, a junior associate emerged from a side door, his posture stiff, eyes flicking toward her with subtle hesitation. "Miss Gaines," he asked, the name catching in his throat like it didn't belong. She stood without a word, walked past the receptionist who refused to meet her eyes, and followed the young man past the frosted glass doors into a narrow corridor of offices. They entered a mid-sized consultation room, more austere than luxurious, with file cabinets in the corner and a pot of plastic ferns under a humming light fixture. Across the desk sat Madeline Prescott, a mid-level wealth liaison with a bone-white smile and eyes that glittered like cut steel. Her tailored red blazer clashed harshly against the room's muted tones, and the way she didn't rise to greet Leora spoke more loudly than any welcome ever could. "We'll be with you in just a moment," she said, her voice crisp, her fingers typing quickly into a keyboard that clicked louder than necessary. Leora waited, one hand resting over her folio, the other in her lap. Madeline glanced once, then again at the screen, lips curling. "Strange," she muttered, loud enough to be heard. She tilted the monitor ever so slightly away from Leora's line of sight. "I'm not seeing a profile under your name." Leora reached into her folio, retrieved the invitation letter with her full identification, and slid it across the table. Madeline didn't pick up. She leaned in instead, eyes narrowing, tapping the keyboard again. "I just want to be sure you're not attempting to access someone else's portfolio. This system is extremely sensitive to identity security." Her tone dripped with sugar-coated skepticism. Leora remained still. Madeline clicked again. Then louder, addressing no one in particular, she raised her voice. "I'm sorry, but there seems to be a discrepancy here." The door remained open, and those passing in the corridor could hear her. "We don't appear to have a client record matching this name under the executive tier profiles." She paused, then spoke again, this time slightly louder, as if the performance needed an audience. "It's entirely possible the account is misfiled under a related party. Are you perhaps accompanying someone else today?" Her eyes flicked to Leora's coat, then to her earrings, understated gold hoops that, to Madeline, read less executive and more entry-level. Leora remained poised, but a slight tension in her temple pulsed. She said nothing. Madeline stood abruptly and crossed the room to the printer, shaking her head as she retrieved a single page. "Just to be safe, we may need to confirm identity through secondary protocols," she said over her shoulder. "You'd be surprised how many mix-ups we get. People who think a name on a shared trust or invitation means access. Unfortunately, in high-net-worth spaces, things aren't always as straightforward as they seem." The implication was razor-sharp. When she returned to the desk, Madeline pushed a form forward. "We'll need to verify this information with our internal compliance team. If you wouldn't mind stepping back to the lobby while we resolve this." Her voice lowered conspiratorially. "We just want to be sure you're where you're supposed to be." Leora slowly leaned forward, placed the sealed investor credential from Dominion Equity, an affiliate so powerful it rarely needed introduction, on the table, and gently slid it toward Madeline. But Madeline did not pick it up. She gave a tight-lipped smile, leaned back, and waved at the assistant lingering near the door. "Devin, please assist Miss Gaines back to reception." Devin's face twitched with discomfort, but he nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Leora stood, the soft creak of her chair the only sound in the room. She paused for a heartbeat, then followed him out into the hall, her heels clicking softly, rhythmically, like a slow metronome of restraint. As she walked past the open office doors, a few heads turned. One man whispered something behind his coffee mug. Another, barely hiding his grin, chuckled to himself and returned to his email. When she reached the lobby again, she found her former seat now occupied. A new client, white mid-20s, shoelaces undone, sat flipping through his phone with headphones in. Leora sat in stillness, one hand resting on the folio in her lap, the other on her knee. Her posture was deliberate, upright, dignified, refusing to shrink despite being sequestered beside a trash bin. Her body absorbed the discomfort, her breath shallow but controlled. Minutes stretched, the low hum of forced air mixing with the intermittent buzz of an outdated intercom overhead. Footsteps clicked behind her. Madeline reappeared. This time, her stride was exaggerated, purposeful, the click of her heels echoing like an announcement. Without so much as a glance in Leora's direction, she turned toward the main reception desk. "Mallory, can you please escort this guest out of the priority zone?" Her voice rang louder than necessary. She may be confused about the services available here. Mallory hesitated, visibly unsure. "Should I?" Madeline interrupted, voice rising again. "We have no record, no appointment, no confirmed identity match. That's a compliance risk." Then, pivoting directly toward Leora, she added, "We're trying to protect our client's privacy. I'm sure you understand." Conversations in the lobby dulled. Eyes turned. A man in a tailored suit sipped his coffee more slowly. A middle-aged couple leaned slightly from their velvet bench, their brows furrowing. A younger associate nearby stopped mid-sentence and watched. Leora met Madeline's stare and held it. Her gaze was unflinching, but her expression revealed nothing. She didn't speak. She didn't move. That silence, once her shield, was now being recast as guilt. Madeline crossed her arms and exhaled through her nose. "We've seen this before," she continued, not bothering to whisper. "People come in with just enough information to bluff their way into client zones. It's a pattern, and frankly, it disrupts the integrity of our brand." She turned her body slightly, performing now for the onlookers. "A few weeks ago, we had someone try to impersonate a minor partner in the Huntley Trust. That person also insisted they were on the books. They weren't. This situation feels identical." The implication was clear. She was labeling Leora, without evidence, as a fraud, a thief, a disruptor. Leora remained composed, but her right hand tightened slightly over the edge of her folio. Madeline continued, gesturing now to a junior staffer who had stepped into the edge of the lobby. "Ben, can you confirm if any Dominion Equity clients are expected today? I need to make sure there's no name confusion." "That's assuming," she paused, scanning Leora once more with transparent disdain. "Someone isn't misusing the name altogether." Ben blinked. I'll check," he said, but his voice faltered. He turned and vanished down the hallway without waiting for a reply. Leora slowly adjusted her seat, crossing one leg over the other, not out of arrogance, but as a declaration of presence. Still, the room watched her with a growing sense of unease. No one intervened. No one questioned Madeline's authority. A man across the lobby tilted his head toward another and whispered something that made the other stifle a laugh. The sound reached Leora. She heard the word pretender. The word trying too hard. Her eyes didn't move, but her jaw clenched. She had sat in investor summits where nine-figure deals turned on a glance. She had once outmaneuvered a pair of banking giants in a midnight arbitration. Yet here she was, being treated like a con artist for simply existing outside someone else's imagination of wealth. Madeline turned back to Mallory. "Have security on standby, please, in case this escalates." Then to Leora again, "You may want to take your documentation to the downtown branch. They're more familiar with walk-in protocols. This location handles advanced tier portfolios, and our standards are different." She smiled sweetly at the end of the sentence, a final blade masked as courtesy. Then she leaned in closer, low enough that only Leora could hear her next words. You should know that just because someone walks in wearing wool and leather doesn't mean they're entitled to sit among people who actually earned their money. Leora didn't flinch. Her expression remained unreadable. But something behind her eyes changed, something cold and ancient and hard like granite submerged in deep water. Just as Madeline turned to leave, another voice cut through the silence. "Excuse me." It came from an older woman seated near the window. White hair, pearl earrings, her voice steady. "I've been watching this, and it's wrong." Murmurs stirred. Madeline's shoulders tensed, then straightened. She spun around slowly, face composed. "Ma'am, I assure you." The older woman raised a hand. "No need to assure me. I've banked here for 21 years. I know what I'm seeing. And this isn't discretion. It's discrimination." But the institution did not wrestle. It recoiled. Madeline remained composed but visibly annoyed, her smile gone, replaced with an expression that oscillated between wounded professionalism and cold contempt. She turned without a word and walked toward the private security station to the left of the reception desk. The room beyond was shielded by mirrored glass, but the door clicked open, and a uniformed man stepped out. He was heavy-set with a thick jaw, cropped hair, and a badge that read Hughes. As he approached, he paused for a second to scan Leora from head to toe, and in that second his expression twisted. It wasn't curiosity. It was appraisal, like assessing a trespasser, not a client. He leaned slightly toward Madeline and muttered something under his breath. Leora didn't hear it clearly, but she caught pieces. Hair like that. Scuffed shoes. Dress looks secondhand. The words weren't meant for her ears, but they struck anyway, each one landing with mechanical cruelty. Madeline didn't push back. In fact, she nodded faintly. Leora remained motionless, her gaze shifting from the glass entrance to the scrolling ticker of client services on the display board. Her name, of course, was nowhere to be seen. Hughes took 2 steps forward, stopping just beside her, standing too close. "Miss," he began, his tone casual but controlled. "We've had some mix-ups lately. People walking in, without appointments, trying to impersonate clients. It gets awkward, you know? Especially when staff have to explain complicated things to people who aren't used to this world." His voice dropped slightly, the edge no longer sharp but smug. "No offense, of course. Just want to be sure you're not getting in over your head." Leora didn't respond. He stared at her a beat longer, then shrugged and turned away, leaving the implication to settle in the air. Mallory at the front desk avoided eye contact again. Madeline stepped forward, re-entering the scene with a tight smile she'd clearly practiced in the mirror. "We understand it can be overwhelming," she said slowly, enunciating each word as if addressing a child. "These financial systems aren't always easy to grasp, especially if you're new to this kind of environment. Trust structures, corporate shields, beneficial ownership. It's a lot." She laughed lightly, as if she had shared an inside joke with the entire room and only one person hadn't caught it. Leora finally looked at her. Her eyes didn't blink. Madeline continued, shifting her stance to rest one elbow on the edge of the receptionist counter. "It's not uncommon for people to assume that if they win a settlement or perhaps are granted funds through certain programs, that they automatically qualify for private financial consultation. But that's not quite how it works. In most cases, we require sustained asset history, verification of income source, and validated accreditation. Unless someone vouched for you, maybe? A sponsor? We're happy to call and confirm." Her tone was sugary now, but the sweetness was laced with venom. Behind her, Hughes let out a small snort, pretending to stifle a cough. A man near the espresso station laughed into his coffee cup. Leora's face didn't change, but a muscle near her temple pulsed again. Madeline turned back toward the front desk and made a show of scanning a clipboard of schedules. "Now," she said, flipping the pages slowly, "we are fully booked for the next 3 hours, and I don't see your name anywhere here. So I'm afraid unless something changes, we'll have to ask you to step aside so our other clients," she gestured broadly toward a waiting group of suited men and polished women, "can be attended to. I'm sure you understand." She punctuated the sentence with a smile that felt more like a challenge than a gesture of kindness. Leora slowly turned her body toward the entrance, her hands relaxed but still clenched around her folio. She didn't speak, didn't argue. She simply took a step back toward the lobby wall, standing now beneath a large digital screen advertising the bank's generational wealth program. A white family of 5 stood smiling beneath the slogan, "Legacy begins here." She glanced at it once, then returned her gaze forward. At that moment, a boy of about 8 walked by, tugging at his mother's sleeve. "Mom," he said, pointing at Leora, "is she in trouble?" The mother leaned down and whispered something hurriedly, pulling him away. Leora remained still. She had endured far worse. But this wasn't just racism. It was reduction. It was the deliberate act of taking a person and slicing away at their identity until only assumptions remained. They weren't just trying to remove her from the room. They were trying to edit her from the narrative altogether. A janitor passed by with a mop, eyes low. Madeline's voice continued to echo faintly behind the counter, speaking not to her, but about her, as though Leora were a logistical error to be managed, a misplaced object whose presence disrupted the aesthetic of wealth and order. The tension hung thick as dust in the afternoon light slanting through the vaulted windows, and though Leora's expression betrayed none of the pain, inside her chest the weight of layered indignity pressed like iron. Suddenly, a door to the left of the concierge station creaked open, and another staff member entered. A man in his late 20s, thin-rimmed glasses, anxious energy in every motion. His name badge read Eric Language Access Coordinator. He stepped quickly toward Madeline, glancing uncertainly at Leora, then back to the woman who had summoned him. Madeline's tone dropped to a mock confidentiality, though she made no effort to shield it from Leora's ears. "Could you just have a word with her?" she asked. "It's possible there's a communication gap. We've had situations before where, well, let's just say not everyone fully grasped the process." Eric nodded slowly, hesitated, then turned to Leora. "Ma'am," he began cautiously, "I'm here to help if anything in the application or account process is unclear. I can go over the basics of how investment accounts, high-yield instruments, or trust allocations function, and if needed, I can provide support in multiple languages." Leora raised an eyebrow, her lips parted slightly, not in confusion but in disbelief. Her voice, when it came, was measured and crisp. "I hold 2 degrees in finance," she said evenly, "and I'm fluent in 4 languages. English is one of them." A quiet gasp somewhere to her right didn't surprise her. What surprised her was that no one else was surprised. They had assumed otherwise because they had wanted to. Eric's face flushed. He began to mumble an apology, but Madeline interrupted, holding out a single-page form in a plastic sleeve. "This is just a standard accommodation document," she said brightly. "We sometimes have people sign this when there's uncertainty. It's nothing serious, just helps us ensure you're receiving the level of assistance best suited to your needs." The paper was titled, "Client Service Waiver Cognitive and Language Support." Beneath the title was a checkbox affirming that the signatory understood they may not fully grasp certain financial terms or procedures and waived liability on the institution's part for resulting misunderstandings. The form was normally used for elderly clients suffering from dementia or for visitors with serious cognitive delays. Placing it before Leora now was not just condescending, it was dehumanizing. A few feet away, 2 associates glanced at each other. One smirked, the other bit her lip to keep from laughing. The subtle cruelty of the gesture settled over the lobby like fog. Leora stared at the form. She did not move. The silence that followed became its own condemnation. Eric, clearly unsettled, stepped away without a word. Mallory began typing again at the desk, though it wasn't clear she was entering anything useful. Madeline, perhaps sensing that her performance had reached its limit, folded her arms and turned back toward her screen, mumbling something under her breath about policy and protocol. Leora, still silent, reached forward, not to sign, but to slowly turn the waiver face down. She pushed it aside and stood. The shift in posture alone seemed to change the atmosphere. For nearly an hour, she had been the subject of ridicule, the passive recipient of microaggressions designed to disorient and diminish. But now, her stillness carried different weight. Now, she was watching them, measuring them, and for the first time, they began to notice. A junior banker, no older than 25, paused mid-stride when his eyes met hers. He blinked, looked away. A woman seated by the refreshment table clutched her handbag a little tighter, perhaps realizing, too late, that she had laughed along with something not quite funny. And Madeline, confident, assertive, superior, glanced up one last time and for the first time didn't smile. She looked at Leora with something else behind her eyes. Uncertainty. Or maybe fear. Leora turned slowly, walked back toward the entrance, her heels clicking with soft authority. She didn't leave. She didn't storm out. Even those who had laughed now avoided looking in her direction. The receptionist typed idly. The espresso machine hissed. The gold-accented wall clock ticked louder than before. Madeline remained behind the counter, her expression unreadable, though her shoulders were just a touch tenser than earlier. Then she stood, not hurried but decisive. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she made her way to the employee hallway, disappearing into the corridor with the measured confidence of someone who believed control had not just been maintained, but affirmed. Moments later, she returned, accompanied by a young man in a navy vest with a bank badge clipped to his breast pocket. His name tag read. He was tall, clean-shaven, and carried himself with the stiffness of someone new to power and unsure how to wield it. Madeline spoke to him in low tones, loud enough for nearby clients to hear snatches of the script. "She's waiting for someone to approve aid," she said, waving a hand vaguely in Leora's direction. "It's likely just a misunderstanding. We get these situations from time to time. Someone sees a nice building, walks in, assumes they're eligible for some of our support programs." Reed nodded, eyes wide with earnest obedience. "Should I escort her out now?" he asked, voice hushed. Madeline shook her head, smiling. "Start by redirecting. Let's not make a scene. If she resists, I'll authorize a formal removal." As if on cue, she lifted the phone from the front desk and tapped into the intercom. Her voice carried with casual cruelty, coded in courtesy. "Attention. Custodial support to reception, please. Area sanitation requested in lobby quadrant B." Several heads turned. Reed approached Leora, hesitated only slightly, then placed his hand near the back of her chair. "Ma'am," he said not unkindly, "we believe there's been a miscommunication. This space is reserved for scheduled clients only. If you're here regarding community relief funds or donation requests, we can connect you with our community engagement office across town." He smiled in a way that told her he believed he was being helpful. Leora didn't move, didn't flinch. Her body remained composed, legs crossed, hands resting gently on her folio. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but unyielding. "I'm not here for charity," she said. "I have a meeting." Reed blinked. "That's not what we were told." Leora didn't answer. She simply watched him. Something in her gaze made him shift uncomfortably, but before he could respond, a janitorial cart squeaked across the floor. A middle-aged man in a tan jumpsuit emerged from the back, pushing a plastic cart loaded with supplies. He glanced at the receptionist, who pointed toward Leora's chair without a word. The custodian approached, pulling a spray bottle from the top shelf, his steps slow, reluctant. "Just need to do a quick disinfect," he muttered. Without asking her to move, he began spraying the air a foot from her seat, then onto the leather cushion beside her, and finally at her own chair's base. The smell of citrus bleach filled the air. The sound of the nozzle clicking echoed louder than necessary. Madeline looked up briefly from her computer screen, then back down as though bored. "We take sanitation very seriously," she offered to no one in particular. "Public health matters, especially in shared spaces." A woman waiting near the elevator frowned. A man in a pinstripe suit shifted uncomfortably and looked away. Leora remained still. The custodian sprayed once more, then reached down to pull her chair away, slowly, awkwardly, as if unsure whether this was part of his job or something else entirely. She rose before he could touch it, stepping lightly to the side, refusing to give them the satisfaction of acting surprised. Reed cleared his throat, stepping forward again. "Ma'am, if you could please wait outside, I can call someone from the outreach office to meet you. They usually handle walk-in requests." Leora said nothing. She turned slightly, just enough to face him head-on, her stance relaxed, but her silence louder now than before. Reed faltered. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Behind him, Madeline typed something quickly, her fingers stiff. The custodian pushed the cart back a few steps and waited, unsure whether to retreat or remain. The scent of bleach still lingered. Finally, a third staffer, a woman in gray slacks and an anxious expression, stepped through the back door with a clipboard. "Excuse me," she said, confused. "I was told there was a guest here for a scheduled appointment with Mr. Vasquez." Madeline looked up sharply. "That's been canceled," she replied. "No such client on record." The woman frowned. "That's strange. He just called and asked if the 11:30 was ready." Madeline paused, just for a moment. "Did he give a name?" The woman flipped the page. "Gaines. Leora Gaines." Silence broke the room. A few clients glanced toward Leora again. A few more looked at Madeline. The receptionist stopped typing. The janitor stepped back. Reed swallowed. Madeline blinked once, the first visible crack in her composure since the moment Leora had walked through the door. The woman, nervous now, clearly unsettled by the tension she had walked into, guided Leora to a polished conference room marked with frosted letters that read Executive Coordination Suite B. Inside, the table was mahogany, the chairs upholstered in rich leather, and the air smelled of sandalwood and silence. Leora stepped in and took her place at the head of the table without asking permission. She didn't have to. She placed her folio down slowly, deliberately, and from it withdrew a slim portfolio bound in midnight blue. On its surface, embossed in gold and without need for explanation, was the seal of Dominion Equity. She opened it with the same composure that had shielded her from every insult she had endured for the past hour. Inside were 4 documents: 1 acquisition agreement, 1 notice of controlling interest, 1 transfer of internal governance protocol, and 1 letter addressed to the Stonefield and Grant Board of Directors. She laid them on the table, spaced evenly. She didn't straighten her jacket. She didn't smooth her skirt. She simply waited. On the other side of the building, a fax machine hummed softly as it delivered a notification stamped with emergency priority clearance. The recipient, Branch Director Charles Wendell. His assistant retrieved it, eyes widening before she even finished reading the header. She stood abruptly, interrupting his conversation with a regional compliance officer. "Sir," she said, handing it to him, "you're going to want to read this immediately." Wendell frowned, took the document, and began to read. His brow tightened. His eyes darted. His lips parted. Then he stood, pushing his chair back so forcefully it nearly toppled. Without another word, he strode through the corridor, his shoes pounding a staccato of rising dread, ignoring greetings, bypassing calls. He passed Mallory without acknowledging her. He passed Madeline, who had just returned to the desk and was reviewing footage from the lobby's security camera with a smug expression. Her smile faded as he barked, "Where is she?" Mallory stammered, She's in Suite B." Wendell didn't slow. He turned the corner, entered the room, and stopped. Leora was seated, hands resting calmly on the table. The portfolio was open. The documents glowed softly under the room's recessed lighting. He froze in the doorway. "Ms. Gaines?" he asked, though the question already sounded ridiculous. Leora lifted her gaze slowly. "You received the fax, I assume?" He nodded once. "This can't be right," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Dominion doesn't." She tilted her head. "Dominion does. Effective this morning." He approached the table, as if stepping toward a confession booth. He leaned in, scanned the documents, and saw it. Her name, printed in firm, serif type, followed by the title that changed everything. Principal Oversight Chair, Dominion Equity Holdings. The signature beneath it matched the one on the acquisition forms. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the controlling interest letter, and read the line that would unravel every decision made by his staff in the past 90 minutes. Effective immediately, all regional branch operations of Stonefield and Grant are subject to compliance auditing and executive oversight under the direction of Ms. Leora M. Gaines. He lowered the letter. His face, drained of color, turned toward her again. "Why didn't you say something?" Her expression was smooth, unreadable. "Why would I?" she asked. "It wouldn't have changed what they saw." He sat, slowly, folding his hands in front of him like a student who had suddenly realized the test had already begun. Outside the glass walls, Madeline appeared at the edge of the hallway, looking in, her face tense. She saw Wendell seated across from Leora. She saw the blue folder. She saw the way his posture had folded inward. And then, finally, she saw the truth. She stepped back, slowly, until the hallway swallowed her. In the conference room, silence expanded like steam from a cracked pipe. Leora slid a document across the table. "This," she said, tapping the first page, "is a full review of discriminatory patterns in client intake metrics, starting with this branch." Wendell nodded, his throat dry. "Of course," he murmured. "Whatever you need." "What I need," she said, "is accountability." Outside, a secretary picked up the phone as calls began to filter in from the upper floors. Legal wanted clarity. Marketing wanted to get ahead of it. Compliance wanted transcripts. But none of them could change what had already happened. The woman they had mocked, doubted, minimized, was the same woman who now held their future in her hands. Leora stood. "Have the staff convene in the main conference room at noon," she said. "We'll begin there." Wendell rose, not as a manager now, but as a subordinate. She did not speak until they reached the financial operations floor, an expansive space reserved for portfolio managers, liquidity analysts, and high-risk oversight specialists. Most had not seen her yet. They had only heard the whispers. She was just another name in an email string. Until now. "Open Terminal 2, she said evenly, pointing to the workstation nearest the liquidity control board. A senior operations officer stepped aside, barely hiding his confusion. "You'll need elevated access credentials," he began, his voice tight, but Wendell raised a trembling hand. "Do it," he said. "Now." The man hesitated, entered a string of codes, then stepped away from the screen. Leora removed a small USB key from her folio and inserted it into the terminal. The system blinked twice, then shifted. Suddenly, the dashboard glowed gold. The Dominion Equity root interface had activated. Those nearby froze. Leora typed a command sequence without glancing down. An interface appeared, listing holdings, not 1, not 2, but 14 offshore accounts, 7 enterprise-grade investment reserves, and 5 capital holding shells, all under a single umbrella. Her name appeared again, now framed in red authorization tags. She turned to Wendell, who by now was visibly sweating. "How much of your quarterly liquidity reserve depends on Dominion-backed credit float?" He stammered, uncertain whether to lie or confess. "Roughly 18%, someone whispered from a nearby desk. "Direct. But if you count auxiliary syndicates, closer to 40. Leora nodded slowly. "Then I imagine this will be significant." She entered a second sequence. The screen refreshed. "Execute authorization package Delta 12, she typed. "Prepare concurrent withdrawal from primary and secondary vault series. Account transfer orders to be timestamped and executed in sequential delay, per protocol." A loading bar appeared. "Confirm disbursement path," the terminal blinked. "Confirm," Leora answered. "Immediate execution." The screen flashed. Then green. Transaction active. From that moment, the system began a cascade. One by one, reserve capital pools blinked from stable to pending to depleted. A junior accountant gasped audibly as lines of credit began evaporating from the bank's own internal tracking sheets. A second terminal blinked red. Partner firm Hudson BlackRock's corporate account was now locked pending verification. A third analyst cursed under his breath as incoming wire clearances were halted, pending reserve confirmation. "She's pulling liquidity," someone whispered. "She's bleeding the vaults." Leora stood still in the center of it all, calm as always. Her eyes didn't flinch. Her voice didn't rise. She watched the digital dominoes fall exactly as she had structured them. The bank, once a fortress of control, was now scrambling. "Send compliance a memo," she said. "Dominion Equity is divesting from all S&G linked entities effective immediately. Audit trail has already been uploaded. We'll forward a clean breakdown once transfer is complete." She turned then, walking past stunned employees, past glass offices where faces turned ghost white, past Wendell, who still stood motionless. She didn't slow. She didn't wait for permission. She entered the executive boardroom without knocking. 6 partners sat inside, mid-discussion, mid-sip, mid-boast, frozen as she entered. The largest among them, a man named Stanton Wells, chairman of the board's Financial Governance Committee, rose halfway before catching himself. "Ms. Gaines," he started, his voice somewhere between deference and disbelief. "We didn't expect." She placed the Dominion folder on the table. "Effective now, your liquidity partners are gone. Dominion has pulled its equity floats, severed syndicate ties, and transferred fiduciary control back to closed trust custody. Your liquidity buffer has 3 hours before the markets smell blood." Someone dropped a pen. No one moved to pick it up. "Why?" Wells finally asked. "Why are you doing this?" She looked at him, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with a calm clarity that burned sharper than rage. "Because you allowed a culture where perception outweighed fact, where faces were judged before credentials, where access was weaponized. Because I walked into your house and you didn't see me. You saw only what you feared I might not be. And now you'll see what I am." Behind her, the door creaked. Madeline stood in the hall, white as paper. She had come to explain, to defend, to perhaps salvage the last threads of her position. But the sight of Leora commanding the very heart of the institution robbed her of breath. Her lips parted, then closed. She turned and disappeared again, swallowed by the silence she had helped create. Leora turned back to the room. "Your systems will hold for a few hours." Madeline Prescott, employee ID #7284BC, was to be immediately placed under administrative hold pending a full ethics review and investigatory audit. Effective immediately, her access credentials were revoked, and all materials she had handled that morning were to be quarantined and reviewed by internal legal counsel. There was no ambiguity, no room for appeal. The language was clean, clinical, final. Mallory didn't call her. She didn't send a message. She simply stood, walked to the corner office where Madeline had returned, and handed her a printed copy. Madeline looked up, her face already pale. She took the paper with one hand, read silently, and froze. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she stood, slowly, deliberately, and reached for her coat. She did not speak to Mallory. She did not demand explanation. Somewhere inside, the understanding had already bloomed, bitter and irrepressible. As she walked through the main corridor, the silence followed her like a shadow. Colleagues who had once laughed with her now lowered their eyes. One man looked down at his shoes. Another pretended to check his phone. The air was thick, not with pity, but with avoidance. People didn't want to see it. Not the punishment, not the consequence. It made things too real. Her steps echoed louder than they should have. Every click of her heel on marble was a memory of something she'd said, a smirk she'd worn, a moment of presumed superiority. When she passed the coffee station, someone had left their cup half-filled and still steaming. She wanted to reach for it, take one last sip of normalcy, but her hand didn't rise. She kept walking. Near the exit, Hughes, the same security guard who had chuckled at Leora's shoes, who had murmured about her hair, stood by the front column, hands folded. He saw Madeline coming, straightened slightly, then stopped. An earpiece buzzed in his ear. He touched it, nodded once, and stepped aside. She didn't meet his eyes. Outside, the afternoon had brightened. The plaza shimmered in the sun, and a breeze moved the flags above the building into slow, deliberate motion. Parked just beyond the front steps was a black sedan with tinted windows and a driver in a gray cap holding the door open. It was the same car that had arrived just minutes earlier, the one Leora had entered without a word. Madeline stopped when she saw it, Her breath caught. The reality settled not just in her mind, but in her body. Every insult she had levied, every assumption she had made, every casual dismissal she had delivered with a smile had been directed at someone who now rode away from this building not in shame, but in power. And she walked out in silence, not even granted the dignity of escort. Wendell watched her from an upper-floor window, his tie loosened, the weight of the morning pressed deep into the creases of his face. He didn't call her. He didn't thank her for years of service. He simply watched her go, just as he would likely be asked to go soon himself. Inside the building, a flurry of movement had begun. Compliance officers were on site. Legal had requested full access to branch surveillance. Every email, every transaction involving Leora's name over the last 18 months was to be pulled and analyzed. Staff who had been in the lobby that morning were called for interviews. Mallory was asked to log all front desk check-in protocols for the past week. Reed, the junior liaison who had offered to redirect Leora, was placed under observation, not penalized, but questioned. The custodial staff was briefed to provide sworn statements about what they had heard, seen, or participated in. Even the janitor who had sprayed around Leora's seat was interviewed, and though he tried to frame it as routine cleaning, the cameras had captured everything. Nothing could be denied. It wasn't just about Leora anymore. It was about the culture, the failure, the cost. Meanwhile, client inquiries began to arrive. Investors had heard the rumors, Dominion pulling capital, a major oversight chair personally intervening at the branch, stories of staff being removed midday. A high-net-worth client from Virginia canceled his appointment. Another from Massachusetts requested documentation proving no bias in service tiers. The brand damage, as the PR team would later call it, had begun to spread like dye in water. And still, in the center of it all, Leora said nothing. She had left no press release, made no social media announcement, issued no statement. She had simply walked into the building, experienced it in full, and responded in the only language they would understand: ownership. She didn't need revenge. She needed recognition. The building stood. The auditorium wasn't large nor particularly elegant, but it breathed with quiet purpose. Its walls, painted a soft slate gray, bore no logos and no portraits, just hand-pinned posters about financial equity, community funding, and small business literacy. Foldable chairs lined the floor in rows of 8, many still unclaimed, while a volunteer adjusted the projector settings at the back of the room. It had been a long week since the incident at Stonefield and Grant. The news had traveled through internal bulletins, industry networks, and finally among clients themselves. No official statement had been made by Dominion, but the silence spoke volumes. The bank's name no longer carried the untouchable aura it once wielded. Compliance crackdowns had swept across several branches, while staff training on unconscious bias was rolled out under urgent timelines. But far from the corporate noise, in this modest community center 2 blocks from a city park, Leora stood in front of a whiteboard, dressed in a simple navy blouse and slacks, outlining the principles of generational wealth to a room of high school students and single mothers. She didn't introduce herself as a CEO or as a power broker. She spoke plainly, but with weight. Her presence filled the room not because it demanded attention, but because it didn't. Outside, the autumn wind swept through the trees, leaving faint golden spirals of leaves across the pavement. And at the door, pausing before entering, stood a woman who once thought herself unshakable. Madeline wore a dark cardigan over a faded blouse, her makeup minimal, her hair shorter than before, as if she had cut away the last remains of the persona that once moved through polished marble like a queen. She clutched a clipboard in one hand and a folded paper in the other, the printed schedule of workshops for the week. She stepped inside slowly, keeping to the edge of the room, and waited until the presentation ended. Her eyes stayed low, her steps quieter. And when Leora stepped off the platform to begin collecting feedback sheets, Madeline approached. She didn't speak at first. She didn't reach out her hand. She simply stood, holding the clipboard forward like a question. The printed volunteer form was already filled out. Name, contact, availability, and in the notes section, A single line in shaky handwriting. "I'd like to help. I'd like to begin again." Leora looked down at the paper, then at the woman holding it. She said nothing. The weight of 7 days stretched between them, filled with what could have been apologies, explanations, excuses. But none of those things arrived. Instead, Leora gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. And that was enough. Over the next hour, Madeline moved between chairs, collecting used pens, organizing feedback slips, refilling paper cups at the refreshment table. She said little. She didn't try to lead. She didn't ask for credit. She just moved, quietly, diligently. And each time she passed Leora, she met her eyes without flinching, but without expectation. The work continued. Over the next few weeks, the center received an increase in attendees. Some came from nearby neighborhoods. Others traveled from distant boroughs, saying they'd heard about the seminars online or through whispers at the library. One evening, a man in a sharp coat showed up, identifying himself as a former client from Stonefield and Grant. He had read about the incident. He had questions. But more importantly, he had children. And he wanted to know how to teach them the things no bank had ever explained. Leora welcomed him in without ceremony. She offered no past. She offered knowledge. And he stayed. At the back of the room, Madeline began arriving earlier, staying later. She helped design flyers. She cleaned storage closets. She listened to presentations again and again, as if trying to memorize what she had once ignored. One afternoon, as Leora wrapped up a segment on compound interest, she turned to find Madeline standing by the supply cabinet, holding a stack of unused workbooks. "Do you want me to distribute these?" she asked. Her voice had changed. Softer. No longer polished. Just real. Leora gave another slow nod. It became their language, silent but not cold, measured but not distant. In time, others in the center began to speak to Madeline without suspicion. A mother with 2 jobs asked her for help filling out a grant application. A teenager asked her to explain a savings challenge she didn't fully understand. Each time, Madeline responded not as an authority, but as a student sharing what she had learned. No one mentioned the bank. No one brought up the past. The space had no need for shame, only for work. One evening, the final group session wrapped earlier than expected. The chairs were empty. The windows glowed orange in the twilight. Leora and Madeline stood side by side in the quiet. The air between them was no longer sharp. It held something else. Something weightier than forgiveness, but lighter than regret. "People change," Madeline finally said. Leora didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence said enough. And together, they turned to finish stacking chairs. 2 women reshaping a future not by erasing what had come before, but by choosing what came next. The end. If this story moved you, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Which part hit you the hardest? Was it the quiet strength Leora showed, or the way everything turned without a single word raised? Tell us your thoughts in the comments, and let us know where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your voice.